Inflammation. Inflammation is also known as the root of all disease. And so we're finding out more and more the role that inflammation, especially chronic inflammation, is playing in a number of different health concerns. And this goes from chronic illness to autoimmune or even difficulties like ADHD or autism. So what is inflammation? Where is it coming from? And how is it contributing to these things? And how can we address and decrease inflammation? Well, oftentimes a lot of our traditional ways of addressing inflammation can be things like anti-inflammatories. It can be either prescription or over-the-counter, like an ibuprofen, or different things that we're trying to say, how can we decrease inflammation? But what is a holistic or alternative way for us to address inflammation? Because these instances when we try to use medication, it really only addresses the problem acutely. And right now, what we're seeing is inflammation over time, leading to chronic inflammation, leading to the health concerns we're seeing. So inflammation, we always say that there's a lot of things are neither inherently good or bad. And in cognitive behavior therapy, this is known as black and white thinking. And the same is true in health. Oftentimes, there's not an inherent good or bad, but it really is always about balance. And inflammation is the same way. For example, if you were to sprain your ankle, your ankle would puff up, likely like a baseball, and there would be bruising on your ankle. And that actually is very good. Seeing the inflammation and seeing the bruising is a positive sign that your body is allocating the resources that it needs to heal the ankle. And so it's a sign that it is sending a lot to the ankle and it is addressing the injury. But the problem is when the inflammation lasts too long. And so in the case of the ankle should clear up. The ankle should not stay bruised, the ankle should not stay inflamed, and we work on decreasing the inflammation after it happens for the ankle to properly heal. And so in that case, the body addresses the issue. It actually, in a short term, inflammation actually decreases the immune response, or cortisol, which produces inflammation, stress, decreases the immune response. And it allows the body to really prioritize the injury. But what's happening is when this is happening and we're not ever resolving. And so therefore, we're living in a state of chronic inflammation. And if you can imagine your body is like a swollen up ankle, how do you think you're going to feel and how do you think your body is going to function? So that's what we're here to talk about, especially as this pertains to kiddos. So one of the things is we're addressing inflammation, but we're addressing inflammation in an acute phase. And so we need to be saying not just how do we take ibuprofen to decrease inflammation for right now, but how do we reduce inflammation overall to make that sustainable and long lasting? Because that's the problem. If it's the inflammation that's lasting over time, do we want to have to take ibuprofen every day? And oftentimes, we're not saying that medication is bad and that there are not times and places for medication. But what we're saying is, in a case where you would be dependent on medication to continue to take it, are there other options we can do that may be more beneficial? And so what are our other options? Not that necessarily like that the ibuprofen is bad, but what are some of the other options we can take that may make actually more of an impact because we're getting to the actual root cause rather than treating the symptom? Oftentimes when we're looking at medications, I was just talking to someone today and we were talking about how you're prescribed a medication for one thing and then you have side effects. And then you're prescribed a medication to then cope with the side effects. And really, what if we looked at what's the root cause or how could we address this before we just kind of start layering things on top? And so not that the medication is inherently bad, but what are we doing to really uncover the source or the root cause? And in this case, oftentimes chronic inflammation is linked to chronic stress or sympathetic dominance. So sympathetic dominance is based on the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system. The sympathetic nervous system is fight or flight, or it's stress. The parasympathetic nervous system is rest and digest, or it's resting, which braking. So we call this gas pedal, brake pedal. So if you can imagine in a car, gas pedal, it revs up the engine, it produces, it says go. And the brake pedal says time to calm down. And so there should be a balance. This should be like a scale. And so our body should push and it should rest. And this should be in balance. We shouldn't be too far this way. And while inherently it seems like the brake pedal would be good, we don't want to be too far to the brake pedal, because too far to the brake pedal actually gets fight, flight, or freeze, which is exhaustion and burnout. And so we don't want to be too far this way. We don't want to be too far this way. Inherently, we just want balance. But what happens is our lifestyles can be high stress. And I'm sure if you're living in a modern day society, you understand. The word stress is thrown around all the time. It's used everywhere. Oftentimes, everyone's talking about stress. And just how much stress we have in our environment. And that's something that I just want to take a deep breath, because it's heavy. It's really heavy. And it's one of the things that a lot of people are experiencing, especially in a post-COVID world. I think that oftentimes, our mental health, and people are feeling a lot of pressure. And, people are talking even about the economy right now, or lots of different issues going on in the world. And it can just feel a lot of pressure, especially when we think about how much information we have constantly at our fingertips and what that's also doing to our mental and emotional health, knowing that we have information about everything that's happening around the whole world all at once, constantly inundating us. Even just on the topic of technology, what that's doing for us. And I have another video on technology and anxiety, but that technology is directly related to anxiety. And anxiety is the fear of what is to come. So fear is oftentimes based in, an imminent danger, but anxiety is the fear of the impending future. And oftentimes when we're filling our brains, or our worlds is very negative, it can really increase that fear of the future. And so you can check out my video on technology and anxiety, and how social media, etc., in stimulation, and even from a sensory perspective, that's increasing our anxiety, and therefore increasing our stress. But that could be work stress, it could be mental and emotional stress, physical stress, which is exercise, slips, falls, or posture, whether that be you're working at a desk and you have bad posture, or your low back is getting a lot of demand. That the research is coming out that sitting might actually even be worse for us than smoking, because of really what a sedentary life does for us. So really, ultimately, we're just constantly inundated with all these things on move more and do all these things, and we're trying our best. So forms of stress, we have that physical stress, which could be posture, or it could be exercise, or it could be an injury, or it could be mental and emotional stress. And then the final one is the environmental stress. And that's what's happening, one, in our environment that we're breathing in, even just environmental pollution. But two, what's happening to our food system, what kind of medications we're on, etc. What kind of things are we constantly taking in that our body is filtering out? And not that our body is not designed to filter it out. What we're saying is, how much and how often are we exposed to these stressors? So our body, going back to the balance, our body is actually designed for stress. So stress is not inherently bad. So when we're exposed to these things, it's not that it's inherently bad. It's that we're exposed to them and we're in an imbalance. And so we're exposed to more stress than we're giving our body support or pushing the brake pedal. And so how much of these forms of stressors are we exposed to, and how often are we exposed to them? And that's going to create the cumulative demand on your body. We have a stress bucket, and in our stress bucket, we're putting stress in. And so that's physical stress, that's mental and emotional stress, that's environmental stress, and so we're continuing to pour into the bucket. Say it's a hose, and the hose is on because we're living in a world, and the hose doesn't stop unless, we force it to stop, or we do something, the hose doesn't stop. Even if you go on a vacation, the hose doesn't stop. And so what we're doing is we have our bucket and our hose is on, so that's pouring in our stress, and then we're draining the bucket. And the draining the bucket is how well we're adapting or we're regulating to the stress, or we're giving our body support. So how well are we regulating to the stress? And that's how well we're draining the bucket. And we should be draining the bucket and filling the bucket. We should be filling the bucket because we exist and we're humans and that's the world, and stress is not inherently bad. But what we should also be draining the bucket at the same time. So that goes back to balance. We should be coming in and we should be going out. So we should really ultimately be regulating and supporting our body to that. So we're able to be exposed to stress and then adapt to it. But what happens is the bucket keeps filling where we're filling in more stress and we're not draining it. And so the bucket gets fuller, 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 fuller until eventually the bucket overflows. And when the bucket overflows, that's symptoms. And so that's when we start to experience symptoms of sympathetic dominance or chronic stress. And one of those symptoms we experience is chronic inflammation. And that's because of what's called the HPA axis, which is the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, produces cortisol and in turn produces inflammation. So this is where we're getting the inflammation. We're getting the inflammation because of the multiple forms of stress. And when we're not regulating and we're stuck in the stress state, we're accumulating chronic inflammation. So that's where the inflammation's coming from. But what does this mean? And what does this mean for us? Well, we know, especially in our kiddos, we know that 27% of children in the United States have a chronic condition, and 1 in 15 have multiple chronic conditions. And so the research is saying that's on a rise, especially amongst our kids. And so really ultimately, what's happening in our world where we're really seeing the rise in this inflammation. And so this is something that is important for us to address because it's impacting everybody. We're seeing more and more so it's impacting our kiddos, and that's just happening throughout our whole life. So what's going on? So we have this high inflammation. Oftentimes people are looking at the gut. So the gut's a big topic right now and its role in inflammation. But what we want to do beyond the gut, that goes deeper than the gut, is we want to address the nervous system imbalance or the nervous system regulation. So when we can get off that gas pedal and we can push the brake pedal, in turn, we can decrease the amount of chronic inflammation that's being produced. And so one of the things like we were talking about earlier, we can have an NSAID, we can throw an NSAID at inflammation and we might be able to help inflammation for 4 to 6 hours. But what if we regulate the nervous system and we help support our bodies against the stress we're experiencing, decrease the stress, but then in turn also give our bodies more support? And that way we can decrease this dominance, bring our body more into balance, and decrease the overall inflammation. And so that's our goal, especially with neurologically focused chiropractic. And we do that specifically through what's called the vagus nerve. The vagus nerve is the longest nerve in the body. It goes directly from the brain to the gut. It's one of the cranial nerves, and it's directly related to the brake pedal. And so when we talk about pushing the brake pedal, oftentimes we're talking about the vagus nerve. Now, research shows that vagus nerve stimulation directly decreased inflammation in the gut. And what's even cooler is that chiropractic activates the vagus nerve. And so through chiropractic, we're actually decreasing inflammation, which another study showed that chiropractic decreases inflammation. And so all of the ways chiropractic and regulating our nervous system, in turn, one, we're going to decrease the amount of inflammation we're producing because we're balancing out our nervous system. We're not stuck in this stress or constantly producing high cortisol. But in two, we're actually decreasing that inflammation. And so that's ultimately going to play a big role because one of the other areas of inflammation that we talk a lot about when it comes to autism or ADHD is called neuroinflammation. And neuroinflammation is inflammation in our brain. There's been lots of research. In fact, this is actually what I did my master's on, is the effect of omega-3 fatty acids on neuroinflammation individuals with autism or on the autism spectrum and how that helps support their body. In turn, regulating the nervous system and decreasing inflammation helps with ADHD, helps support autism, all these things that decreasing inflammation, autoimmune, chronic conditions, all of these things that are rooted in inflammation. When we decrease our stress, that can impact, and we regulate our nervous system, that can impact everything because, like we said in the beginning, inflammation is truly the root cause. And so what do we need to do to address inflammation? So those are just a few key things on inflammation, what inflammation is affecting, and how we can address inflammation by stimulating the vagus nerve and by regulating the nervous system. So one of the ways in our office we measure inflammation to see physiologically what's going on, we measure the inflammation through what's called a neurothermal scan, which specifically follows heat. Heat follows inflammation, and so we can see where in your body and throughout your spine you're carrying inflammation or your kiddo's carrying inflammation. And then the next thing we do is we measure your HRV, which is your adaptability to stress, which shows us the sympathetic dominance and the parasympathetic to see how balanced and how regulated your stress bucket is. How bogged down or how full is your stress bucket? So go ahead and schedule an appointment to get you in so we can get your scans so we can see how your nervous system is functioning. And so we can start looking at how much inflammation your body has, and we can unlock the key for health for you or for your kiddos. We look forward to seeing you. Comment below if you've learned something new or if you yourself have experienced high inflammation.